writes, "In times of peace and prosperity, cities and individuals alike follow higher standards because they are not forced into a situation where they do not have to do what they do not want to do." Here, with the phrase city and individuals, Thucydides makes explicit his view, which I referred to above, that moral judgments can be either collective or individual. He ends this theoretical passage with another reference to circumstances. In this case, he uses the second of the terms for this on your handout, ta paronta, literally things that are present. And he makes a strong restatement of the negative side of his theory, beginning with one of his most quoted phrases: "War is a violent teacher. In depriving them of the comfortable provisions of daily life, it brings most people's tempers down to the level of their circumstances." So Thucydides indicates in this scheme that humans are responsible agents who can have some control of circumstances, but as he predicts, and as history proves, that control will rarely be complete, it will often lead to no good, and it will never be of indefinite duration. Moses Finley, a great and late scholar on ancient Greece, wrote of Thucydides' history, "There is not a sentence in the book that states explicitly what Thucydides thought history was, why it was worth a lifetime of very hard effort to write a detailed and accurate history of the war, or why that history could claim to be a possession for all time. I think only the adverb explicitly makes that a true statement. For Thucydides' theory and his narrative as the basis of that theory leaves no doubt that what he thought history was about, though he was thoroughly reinventing it. Why he thought his history was worth writing, it is useful, and why it was to be a possession for all time, because there is at least the potential for future readers to learn and apply its lessons." Now for some examples of how Thucydides' narrative underpins his theory of collective and individual natures reacting to and compounding historical circumstances. Like Plato and Aristotle and the two generations after him, Thucydides had little faith in the collective wisdom of the Athenian citizenry, those who, meeting in first assembly, had the final say on all big issues of politics and war. They often made bad decisions under the influence of ignorant and unscrupulous demagogues. This was one of the observations of Thucydides that most appealed to Hobbes's political thinking. Thucydides' account of the savagery of the Peloponnesian War shows that even in a society of laws, without good leadership, human life could become, as Hobbes saw it in its natural state, nasty, brutish, and short. Still, there were the rare instances of the Athenian assemblies having effective leadership and therefore following, in Thucydides' words, higher standards. A smart leader was Pericles, the son of Xanthippus. True, his unbending imperialism was a cause of the war. That and his funeral oration proved that his strongest suit was realpolitik. But he had the wits and authority to persuade the Athenians that they could effect an indefinite stalemate of the war. If they halted the expansion of their empire and avoided battle with the superior Spartan infantry, allowing the Spartans to pillage the Athenian countryside while its farmers and herders crowded within the fortified city and harbors and lived on the money and grain the navy brought in from the empire. This strategy doubtless saved many lives on both sides until Pericles died in the third year of the war, probably from the Great Plague. To explain Pericles' beneficial leadership, Thucydides gives one of his brief and infrequent estimations of character, one that somewhat exaggerates the statement's immunity to public opinion. Pericles, because of his position, his intelligence, and his known integrity, could respect the liberty of the people and at the same time hold them in check It was he who led them rather than they who led him. And since he never sought power from any wrong motive, he was under no necessity of flattering them. Thucydides gives much attention to the great plague that ravaged Athens off and on for 3 years. The account is not a digression. As a good historian of the war, Thucydides would have treated the plague at least because, as he says, nothing did the Athenians so much harm as this, or so reduced their strength for the war. But the plague also bore out his theory of human reaction to circumstances, in this case, both natural and man-made circumstances. He lays out an exhaustive list of physical and mental symptoms of the disease, not just for its own effect, but to give his readers the context for his account of moral deterioration. The onset of the plague was to Thucydides an accident of nature, but the overcrowded city was a circumstance of Pericles' war strategy. Thucydides says, there was no record of the disease being so virulent anywhere else or causing so many deaths as it did at Athens. A factor which made matters much worse than they were already was the removal of people from the country into the city, and this particularly affected the incomers. There were no houses for them, and since they lived during the hot season in badly ventilated huts, their death rate was beyond all control. But the problems of human behavior did not stop there. The plague, to use Thucydides' words, brought most people's tempers and their actions down to the level of their circumstances. He writes, the catastrophe was so overwhelming that men, not knowing what would happen to them next, became indifferent to every rule of religion or of law. Athens owed to the plague the beginnings of a state of unprecedented lawlessness. As for what is called honor, no one showed himself willing to abide by its laws, so doubtful was it whether one would survive. As for offenses against human law, no one expected to live long enough to be brought to trial and punished. The plague was also one of the occasions that Thucydides took to reject explicitly and implicitly the common Greek thinking of the role of the supernatural in human circumstances. He says, there was no other, this is about the plague still, there was no other human art or science of any help at all. Equally useless were prayers made in the temples, consultations of oracles, and so forth. Indeed, in the end, people were so overcome by their sufferings that they paid no further attention to such things. As for the gods, it seemed to be the same thing whether one worshipped them or not, when one saw the good and the bad dying indiscriminately. We have nothing explicit about Thucydides' personal religious beliefs. His editorializing is infrequent, and he rarely refers to himself. Plutarch's greatest praise of Thucydides is his ability to turn the auditor into a spectator. Meaning by that, Thucydides refrains from intrusive personal discourse and conjecture and forms his history from its actors and their actions. While Thucydides occasionally makes a point of archaeology from the evidence of poetry, arguably the most extraordinary novelty of his work is the absence in it of the historical and poetic Greek tradition that the gods have a hand in human conflict. This rationalism about the supernatural, which has more in common with the medical writings of his contemporary Hippocrates than with earlier histories, is wholly consistent with Thucydides' theory of the responsibility of human nature and history.